All right, Bio 30. So we're going to continue our discussion here regarding neurons. So there's three types of neurons: sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. Sensory and motor neurons have that myelin sheath, that insulation. They are important to transmit information long distances and um, make sure that that information is never lost in terms of uh, electrical signaling throughout those long distances. Interneurons are typically shorter. They don't have to travel as far, and so they don't need that myelin sheath insulation because we're not worried about degradation over such short lengths. Sensory neurons carry information from sensory receptors or affectors to central nervous system, to the brain or spinal cord. So like this is like, sensory neurons in your ears, or sensory neurons in your eyes, or sensory neurons in your skin for touch receptors, in your nose for smell, chemoreceptors. So we'll talk about each of the sensory systems, eyes, ears, all that stuff throughout the next unit here. But sensory neurons themselves are simply information collectors. They transmit that information into the central nervous system. Interneurons are pretty much the brain and spinal cord. They integrate and interpret and process the information. So they carry and sort of translate the information between the sensory and motor neurons. They're short, so they don't need myelin insulation. And then you've got your motor neurons, which send information from the central nervous system to effectors, which include glands and muscles. So this is information out of the CNS to things, to places like muscles or to glands. So the whole body is in the nervous system is trying to input, integrate, and respond. So the input is your sensory neurons, the integration is your interneurons, and the response is your motor neurons. So you've got affectors, you've got effectors, and they're sorted by the interneurons. Okay. A reflex arc is involuntary and unconscious. If you touch a hot stove, you pull away. You don't have to think about blinking. You blink automatically when your eyes get dry. You can consciously blink, but it's got nothing to do with why you blink naturally because it's all involuntary. And the whole point of a reflex arc is to be fast. So it's got five major components: the affector, the sensor, the sensory neuron, which transmits that information through a neuron, an interneuron, typically in the spinal cord, and then a motor neuron, which attaches to an effector. So basically, this is as if I took my finger, poked a sharp object. The sharp object stimulated my affector, my sensory neurons in my skin. That information got transmitted down a sensory neuron all the way up my arm into my spinal cord, where the interneurons processed the information and said, bro, pick up that finger because you're on a sharp object. So then the motor neuron sent a signal down to the effector, a muscle or a series of muscles which help me lift my finger away. Right? The patella reflex is very similar. So again, we start off with an affector or sensory receptor. It goes through a sensory neuron, gets processed by an interneuron in the spinal cord. The answer or the response gets sent out through a motor neuron, and then finally it ends at an effector or a muscle. So ASME is a acronym that may or may not help you remember the order of those. So in the reflex arc, to review here, we've got an affector, which is a receptor, senses the stimulus, and the nerve impulse is initiated. The sensory impulse is then carried through sensory neurons to the spinal cord. Interneurons in the spinal cord are coordinating and interpreting and processing that information and converting it into an appropriate motor neuron response. The motor neuron is going to carry that response from the spinal cord all the way to an effector, a muscle or a gland or something that responds to that input. Okay, that's topic 2. That's going to be our sensory information. The next unit will talk about what that actual sensory neuron looks like what the response, what the signal looks like. And we'll talk about action potentials and various ions that are involved.